So just a very significant sort of contrast to what happened, the fate that befell Franklin. So next slide. Show just a little background. Two ships, Erebus and Terror, 129 officers and crew, 3 years provisions, including, of course, lime juice and 8,000 tins of preserved meats, vegetables, and soup, along with the usual staples of this kind of travel with salt, beef, and pork, and so forth. So, as I mentioned, initially the command was offered to Sir James Clark Ross, who had returned from some notable explorations of Antarctica, but he declined the assignment, and there's speculation historically as to why he would have passed on this. One argument was that he had actually developed a drinking problem. Um, Another theory is um, that he well, I think that was that was the major one, but the expedition ultimately did not go to the other was that he had been recently married and he didn't want to leave his new bride. And then other theories suggest that maybe the drinking problem and the marriage were somehow related. But anyway, that's all beside the point. He declined the command of the expedition. He would have been a very logical choice for it. And so the next slide will show that Sir John Franklin was given the command. And Franklin, as I'm sure many of you know, had commanded two overland expeditions. The first surveyed 340 kilometers of the Arctic coastline, but it was a bit of a minor disaster in the sense that 10 men died during that. There was starvation amongst the survivors. And Franklin himself became quite famous as a man who ate his boots in order to survive, his leather boots in order to survive. But then he undertook a second expedition, 1825 to 27, which surveyed 640 kilometers of coastline in the Arctic. And so that was a much more successful expedition, showing that Franklin had learned some lessons from the first one. In fact, he had added more to the coastal map of Canada than anyone except George Vancouver. So really a remarkable pair of expeditions. He was knighted in 1829, married the famous Lady Franklin, Jane Griffin, and then was subsequently appointed the governor of Van Diemen's Land, so Tasmania. And when he was back from that assignment, he caught wind of this expedition. He put his hand up and lobbied for the command, but he was told no, he was too old for this. He was 60, to which he replied, "No, my lord, I'm only 59." And apparently this was a compelling argument, and that helped him to secure the command, which he received on the 7th of February, 1845. Next slide. And for some reason, he is missing from this his name, but you can see these wonderful daguerreotypes, which are very famous. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Actually, depictions of Sir John Franklin, Captain Francis Crozier, who was second in command and captain of Terror, and Commander James Fitzjames, captain of Erebus. So these are the three commanding officers of the 1845 British Arctic expedition. Next slide. And there's a great confidence in the likelihood of success. You can see Roderick Murchison, president of the RGS, said that the name of Franklin alone is a national guarantee. Harry Goodsir, assistant surgeon on Airbus, remarkable young scholar and scientist whose loss, I think, probably is one of the great disasters of this particular episode. He said that all the officers are in great hopes of making the passage and expect to be in the Pacific end of next summer. So a very optimistic view of how things were likely to go. So in May 1845, there was the official inspection of the ships, and they departed later that month. And they were last seen in Baffin Bay in August 1845, last seen by Westerners, whalers, as they entered the Northwest Passage. And it was in March 1848 that the need for a relief expedition was first raised. Next slide. And then this began a sequence of expeditions to try to understand what had happened to Franklin. Ross came out of his retirement and led a Royal Navy relief expedition in 1848-49. And it really was the only expedition with a theoretical chance of rescuing some surviving members of Franklin's expedition. HMS Enterprise, an investigator, wintered at Port Leopold, that's on Somerset Island, and they carried provisions for 4 years. Some of those provisions intended to feed surviving members of the Franklin crew. Rockets were fired each morning and evening. Foxes were trapped and little messages put around their necks and released. And sledge parties were sent out in the spring of 1849. And one with Ross and McClintock, who we'll talk about in a minute, reached 200 miles from where Franklin's ships had been the previous summer. So it was really a significant search effort. But strangely, given the general success of earlier expeditions in the Arctic, excepting Franklin's, there had been a number of deaths, a surprising number of deaths at over the winter on Ross's expedition. And some of the symptoms, there were 7 deaths in all, and some of these symptoms were very disturbing, very unusual. And in fact, the surgeon reports describe instances of some of them dying of nostalgia. Um, and Ross himself said, "We have certainly had to grapple with difficulties of no ordinary nature." So it was a very strange year, again, contrasting with even his uncle's expedition upon which he was a member. Just in terms of the scale of losses of men and the illness that afflicted the expedition. So he returned after just a single winter in the Arctic, and he probably did so wisely, because to have stayed a second year would have likely seen an even greater loss of life. Next slide. So then we jump forward a little bit to 1850, where the first traces of the Franklin expedition were located at Cape Riley on Devon Island. And then very quickly, I can see, just as you can see, a few days later, Franklin's first winter quarters was located at Beattie Island. So there was evidence of an armorer's forge, there was storehouse, large cairns, and the graves of 3 sailors from the missing expedition were located on the 27th of August, 1850. So these are the graves of Torrington, Hartnell, and Brain. Likely the first 3 members of the expedition to die, certainly the first and only proper graves related to Franklin. You can see some beautiful renderings of Beach Island. I've been there many times, and some of you maybe have had the pleasure of visiting. Very beautiful spot, but these cliffs are there's a little bit of artistic license, let's put it that way, in these renderings. Next slide. And of course, the person that your society concerns itself with, Dr. John Ray, who had participated in a whole series of overland expeditions trying to understand the fate of the Franklin expedition. And really, Ray made some highly significant discoveries, and especially in the spring of 1854, encountering Inuit who had Franklin related artifacts in their possession. And it was from some of the Inuit that he encountered that he received a really deeply upsetting and troubling account of the final days of the expedition and reports of cannibalism. And this famous quote, which I'm sure is etched into your collective memories, from the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last resource, cannibalism, as a means of prolonging existence. So reported Ray. This was not received well in the United Kingdom. It seemed incomprehensible that these Royal Navy seamen would resort to cannibalism, even in extreme circumstances. And Charles Dickens was one of many who kind of rejected the idea out of hand. He said that it was the chatter of a gross handful of uncivilized people with the domesticity of blood and blubber. And Justice Daly, who was then president of the American Geographical Society, went further. He said, in his view, that Franklin's men had been, quote, murdered by the Indians who had already imbued their hands in the blood of white travelers. So this is the kind of racist view of the Inuit that was, I think, fairly, unfortunately, fairly widely shared at the time. And, again, the view that Franklin seamen, even driven to the extremes in order to survive, would have considered even cannibalism, was just something that people had real trouble getting their heads around. Next slide. Um, So then we have Francis Leopold McClintock, who was a Royal Navy officer and veteran of three of the earlier Franklin searches, including, as I mentioned, Ross's search. And he was given a command of the steam yacht Fox in 1857. So this was really a private expedition. It was funded by public subscription. It was at the urging of Lady Franklin. And the Admiralty helped support it with the donation of supplies. They erected a monument to Franklin and his officers and men at Beattie Island on behalf of Lady Franklin. That monument is still on Beattie Island. And but this is the expedition that really kind of helped us to understand just how horrific the end of the expedition was. In April 1859, two sledge parties departed Fox for King William Island. So this is the area that they were focusing in on as the likely spot for discovery of the fate of Franklin. Next slide. And there, in April 1859, McClintock received an Inuit account of two abandoned ships. One was reported to have been sunk in deep water. The other ship had been visited by the Inuit. So these were descriptions of clearly Franklin's ships. In May, McClintock's party discovered a bleached skeleton in the uniform of a Royal Navy steward, laying face down on a gravel ridge on King William Island. And this site of this skeleton sort of collapsed, literally lying where the men had collapsed, did support the Inuit accounts of men who fell down as they walked along. They found what they described as a field hospital located 80 miles from a place known as Crozier's Landing, and they found a lifeboat with two human skeletons inside. Also, all sorts of objects which have been the subject of a great deal of speculation by historians as to why they would have carried things like books and scented soap and curtain rods with them in the lifeboat. So McClintock described it as an accumulation of dead weight, very likely to break down the strength of the sledge crews. So really sort of a puzzling situation where the ships are not found. Skeletons are found, some kind of collapsed, others related to this lifeboat filled with all these sort of this strange, eccentric collection of artifacts. Next slide. And finally, then the critical discovery, a Franklin record found near Victory Point. That's at the sort of the northernmost point of King William Island, dated 5th of May, 1859. And the first message was dated 24th of May, 1847. Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition, all well. This was a standard Royal Navy sort of form that had been filled out. They were meant to leave all along the expedition route that would, provide intelligence to anyone who might come looking for them or follow in their footsteps. What was really interesting here is a year later, there's a second message, 25th of April, 1848. Her Majesty's ships Terror and Erebus were deserted on 22nd of April, having been beset since 12 September 1846. Sir John Franklin died on 11th June 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been, to this date, 9 officers and 15 men, and start tomorrow, 26 for Back's Fish River. So you can see now it's starting to make a little bit of sense. The ship's trapped. The men suffering these long Arctic winters, finally decision made that they were not going to be freed from the ice, and they desert, in the words of this message, the vessels, and drag these lifeboats headed for, strangely, the Back River, this would have required Franklin and his men to make a journey across the barren lands of what's now Arctic Canada, a harrowing journey that Franklin himself had lost. As mentioned earlier, a number of men on his first Arctic overland expedition. A very, very difficult journey, and the likelihood of success must have been, in their minds, even almost insurmountable. What is curious as to why they did not follow the example of Sir John Ross and head to the north and east, where, of course, we know that James Clark Ross had sailed initially to search for Franklin, and where there was at least the possibility of reaching help via as Ross had, via whalers who worked in the Lancaster Sound area. Next slide. So, from this, we get a kind of a sense of, for some reason, the red line is not appearing. Maybe if we reload that, there we go. You can see here the initial season is the green line, and then the red line following the assumed route of the expedition down off the northwest coast of King William Island. Next slide. So this talk is really, it's just a very quick overview of the expedition. And this talk is really focused on the Franklin Forensic Project, which, as I mentioned, was led by forensic anthropologist Owen Beattie of the University of Alberta. I was honored to participate in Owen in writing this book, and have been to Beach Island, King William Island over the years many times. Next slide. This is King William Island, and you can see some of the multi-year ice off the north west coast of King William Island, even in this satellite image. And you can imagine that the ice conditions would have been even more severe in Franklin's time, but definitely an area where ice grinding down from the north enters this channel, and you can see how a ship could be trapped there. Now, at the time, and based on the maps, the charts that Franklin had with him, it was believed that King William Island was actually King William Land, that it was connected to the North American mainland. And this was an error that had been made by James Clark Ross in the earlier Ross expedition. The view that this was likely just an isthmus, or at least connected by land to the continent. In fact, had Franklin gone down the east coast of King William Island, he would have quite possibly managed to complete the Northwest Passage. But he instead went into the multi-year ice along the west coast. Next slide. So as mentioned, Owen is now retired, but a forensic anthropologist at the University of Alberta. He conducted two surveys on the south and west coast of King William Island, and followed by two field seasons on Beattie Island. And the two overland surveys on King William Island identified the remains of between 7 and 15 Franklin individual members of the Franklin expedition, and a number of associated artifacts. You can see, for example, of the pipe bowl on the left side of this image, and then the other is a boot, part of a boot sole that had been altered with screws through the bottom of the boot to give traction for, I guess, hauling the sledges. So these are artifacts that were still there when he visited in the early 1980s, and you could get a sense of the landscape of King William Island. It's they're different. The Canadian Arctic is varied. You get some spectacular cliffs and topography in some parts of it, but here, as you can see, it really is a pancake of gravel. That's what King William Island is. It's a desert of gravel, and it just gives you a sense of that image on the right of what the landscape is like. Next slide. So the result of the analysis of the bone collected, and by the way, the image you're seeing, this image here is actually of the articulated foot of one of the Franklin's men that was located on King William Island. So the research, and as a forensic anthropologist, Owen hoped that he could cast some light on the excuse me, on the health of the Franklin sailors near the end of this expedition. And one of the prevailing theories is that scurvy had played a serious role in the destruction of the expedition. And indeed, the bone collected on King William Island did betray evidence of scurvy. And this was the first time physical evidence had been found to support the presence of scurvy near the end of the expedition. So there was shallow pitting and scaling on the outer bone surfaces, consistent with documented cases of vitamin C deficiency. There are also evidence of hemorrhages between the thin skin and long bone surfaces and bone remodeling. So these are all clear evidence that scurvy had indeed played a role in the final days or late in the expedition. Next slide. And the first ever physical evidence to support John Ray's account that cannibalism had been a factor in the expedition, and near the end of the expedition, that the men had been forced to resort to cannibalism. And you can see this image of a right femur, which is showing cut marks that were made by a metal implement on this bone. There are also the little map or chart that you're showing here indicates where bone was found scattered around a tent circle. And what was interesting is that you could see that the men were consuming selective parts of the skeleton of one of their fellow crewmen, and there were specific parts of the body had been taken with them, almost as if they had carried a portable food source at this point. This at the Booth Point. This is at the far southern coast of King William Island, right before the men would have tried to cross over to the North American mainland. So they were already in an absolutely desperate situation at this point, and they were carrying, legs, head, and arms of one of their colleagues as a portable food source. Next slide. The unexpected and surprising find, as a result of the analysis of the bone collected on King William Island, was through trace element analysis, the presence of extremely high levels of lead found in the bone of these Franklin crewmen. And lead is a insidious poison that has all sorts of very serious health consequences. Weakness and fatigue, stupor, paranoia. You can see the list here: abdominal pain, anemia, other physiological and psychological symptoms. And you can see also the astonishing comparison between lead levels found in the bone of Inuit collected from King William Island, 22 to 36 parts per million, compared to 228 parts per million for the bone that was located at Booth Point, that belonged to a Franklin crewman. The year two results from the second field season again show this dramatic difference between the lead levels contained in Inuit bone vis-a-vis the Franklin crewmen. So clearly, lead had a serious impact on the health of the Franklin crewmen. This is, something that really can't be contested insofar as the results would stand up in court. The fact is that there was heavy lead loading in the bone related to Franklin's men. The question was, where did the lead come from, and whether or not it's possible that some of the lead exposure would have come just from sitting on the surface of King William Island, perhaps leaching into it from some of the mineralizations, that kind of thing. So ideally, it was necessary to try to study remains of expedition members who had died earlier on. And so if we can go to the next slide, Owen visited Beach Island. So if we just keep zeroing in the next slide again. There we go. And the next slide takes you to Devon Island. Next slide, Beachy Island. And here it is. You can see a little tiny island actually connected to Devon Island much of the time. And again, hallowed ground for anyone interested in the Franklin expedition. I've been there many times over the years, and it's now adventure cruise ships stop by there, and it really is a remarkable, very powerful site where you can see the graves of the three Franklin seamen who were interred there. Next slide. So Owen got secured permission from Canadian authorities, the territorial government, the federal government, and also the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to exhume the known Franklin graves at Beachy Island. He also contacted the Royal Navy in the UK and secured their permission and tried to contact family members by writing the Times newspaper and did not unfortunately receive any at the time any correspondence from family, but did receive the permits necessary to undertake the exhumation of three graves. Now, I don't know if I assume that some of you at least are familiar with this research, and you will know in that case that the exhumations revealed an astonishing level of preservation. If any of you are squeamish, this is always the point that I would suggest you log off, or if I'm speaking in person, if I were speaking in person, I'd suggest that you maybe avert your eyes or exit the room because I'm going to show you the incredible level of preservation of the three sailors who had been buried into the permafrost, which has when these photos were initially released, captured the imagination of people all over the world. And indeed, I've given this talk not recently, but gave it many times in classrooms, and I always would warn the kids to look away and to, if they were squeamish, and I never once saw a kid looking away. It's just they're very powerful images, and our curiosity is such that people can't help but look at the photos. So here we go. Melt the ice, loosen the fabric, and eventually with tweezers pull some fabric back. And at the moment he pulled it, it sort of came loose, and he was looking into the eyes of John Torrington, this young petty officer who had died, so many years earlier. So an incredible level of preservation. You could see the eyelashes, you could see the eye color. The eyes are open because of the sort of the freeze dry effect where the moisture leaves the tissues. So the eyelids opened up. But it was quite a powerful experience, as you can imagine. Next slide. So the ice was melted, and the body was eventually freed from this block of ice that had preserved it so well. And an autopsy was conducted, just as is commonplace in hospitals all over the world after a death, to try to understand what had happened to John Torrington, why this young man so early on in the expedition, the first winter, had perished. Next slide. And this is the image of Torrington that went around the world. The Tonight Show, which I don't think you would have seen in Scotland, but Johnny Carson's famous American talk show host had this photo on his show and talked about it. People magazine, which I'm not sure you have there either, but very big magazine in North America, actually named John Torrington one of that year's most interesting personalities, which I think says something about some of the other stars and celebrities they had profiled. Anyway, an amazing image of a Victorian sailor, a member of one of the most remarkable, important polar expeditions ever. Next slide. And this is John Hartnell. So over the course of two field seasons, all three members of the expedition on Beach Island were exhumed. This grave was interesting in the sense that it had already been disturbed. In fact, we through archival research learned later that Hartnell's grave had been opened by one of the search expeditions to try to do exactly what the research Owen led was trying to do, and try to better understand what had happened to the Franklin expedition. So the fact that one eye is missing here and that there was damage to the lid, which you can see on the left-hand image, is really a result of the much more sort of rough exhumation that took place in the years after the disappearance of Erebus and Terror. Next slide. And then William Brain, the last of the sailors to have been buried at King William Island. His face was covered by this red kerchief, which was from India, and he was in he was in the worst condition of the three bodies. It looked as if he had been dead for a period of time before they were able to finally bury him. So, not as well preserved as the others, but still remarkable given the amount of time that passed between his death and exhumation. Next slide. So from the exhumation of the bodies on King William Island, it was learned that all three had suffered from tuberculosis, not entirely surprised given the time that they were living in, and they had died of pneumonia. All three also were suffering from lead poisoning. The lead levels in the soft tissues average 10 to 30 times higher than modern unexposed individuals. So really an incredible burden of lead that they were exposed to. And lead poisoning can be termed has been termed the aping disease because it can simulate other medical conditions. In fact, in the context of an Arctic expedition, its symptoms, which include emaciation, discoloration of the gums, abdominal colic, shooting pain in the limbs, would have suggested to surgeons on the expedition the scurvy. It's very likely that the physicians aboard the vessels would have concluded that these men were suffering from scurvy, and consequently, they likely would have try to give them preferred food source on the expedition to try to rebuild their health. And most poignantly, for those that ended up dragging the heavily laden sledges later in the expedition, lead poisoning has a mean way of penalizing the extremity most used in muscular effort. So clearly, lead would have had some impact on the general health of the expedition. Especially as it went on over those winters. Next slide. And I guess the obvious next question then was, well, where did the lead come from? Is this it's been speculated. I know Pierre Burton in his book Arctic Grail took issue with the idea that the exposure had come on the expedition. His view was that, pretty much everyone in the UK at the time, and this would be, I guess, collectively, some of your ancestors would have similarly been exposed to these elevated levels of lead. But what's interesting, though, is that the lead isotope ratio analysis showed that the lead in the bodies was from a single European geological location. Obviously, if it was a generalized exposure to lead just from the environment of the day, the lead would have been sourced from a whole bunch of different mines and different geological locations. But this, in fact, was lead all from a single geological site. And the lead in the tissue of these men was identical to the solder used in the tin cans taken on the expedition. And you can see from this diagram various different samples of either tissue or solder. And you can see that in the Franklin expedition, right in the middle there, all was identical. The lead in the solder was the same as the lead in the tissues. It all came from the same geological source. So that is a smoking gun to suggest that the tin food supply, this new innovative tool for exploration, actually contributed to the decline in the health of the crew. Next slide. So that's sort of my first involvement with the Franklin expedition. Later on, um, some years later, I participated in the Victoria Strait expedition, which was a Parks Canada led effort to locate Erebus and Terror. I'll go through this very quickly because I know we don't have a ton of time and there may be some questions. So I'll just whip through this part of it just to talk about the expedition. This is the area, excuse me, off the northwest coast of King William Island where we were to search. Next slide. Um, well, that's just a pretty bear picture. You can't talk about the Arctic without including at least one polar bear. Again, the northwest coast. We were next slide after this. Actually, you'll see the two areas that were the focus of the Victoria Strait expedition. The northern search box, which covers the area of the Royal Geographical Society Islands, and then off the west coast, northwest coast of King William Island, and then the search box to the south, which was off the mainland. So those are the two areas that we were searching. I was up in the northern search box. The next slide. I just wanted to show you the ice conditions here, where you can see it's the same area we're just looking at. You can see King William Island sort of in the lower right-hand corner, the Royal Geographical Society Islands kind of then to the east, and you can see that looks like film over the water there is all ice. And the right-hand image, you can actually see where the ice is starting to break up and travel south, this ice buildup. Just to show why, when there was a find, how that ship might have ended up where it ended up. Next slide. So the expedition had a series of different ships involved. The Canadian Coast Guard, Arctic Research Foundation, and the One Ocean Expedition and the RCGS, Royal Canadian Geographical Society, were involved. Next slide. Again, showing this is the area off the northwest coast of King William Island, the area where Franklin's ship was reported to have been deserted. Next slide. And this is just showing the ice chart for the period that we were working there. And you can see the intensity of ice off that area, the northwest coast of King William Island. And that's where we were meant to be surveying. As you can imagine, you can't really do much in terms of deploying an autonomous underwater vehicle when you have ice cover like that. So we were really hamstrung by the ice conditions. Next slide. This just shows the transfer of this little vessel, the Investigator, this tiny boat on the right, from our vessel to the Coast Guard. This is significant because that small boat owned by Parks Canada was the vehicle which was ultimately successful in this search. Next slide. We were deploying an AUV, this autonomous underwater vehicle, this amazing piece of technology, which is like a torpedo, which you can program, and it will basically effectively mow the lawn. It'll go back and forth surveying an area of the seabed. And it was our hope that this would be a critical tool in locating one of Franklin's ships. In fact, as we now know, we were, even when we were able, because the ice cleared long enough to deploy the AUV, we were not working. The Victoria Strait was not an area where either ship was located. But still, it was amazing. That's next slide. Amazing piece of technology to deploy this and to see the capacity. So that's a photo I took of it being deployed. Next slide. So we were involved in this high probability area, the northern search area, as identified by Parks Canada. Of course, we now know neither ship was there, and we actually only were able to survey a very small area because ice kept closing in and affecting our operations. Next slide. Instead, it was by pure happenstance or luck that a discovery was made. This is a photo from a helicopter that had been deployed off that Canadian Coast Guard ship I mentioned to land on a little islet off the North American mainland because an archaeologist aboard had identified an interesting Inuit feature. So the helicopter landed on this little island, and the archaeologist went off to investigate this Inuit structure. And the pilot of the helicopter went for a stroll along the beach of this island. And of course, next slide, it was the Andrew Sterling, the pilot, not an archaeologist, not a specialist, but a remarkable aviator, who discovered this ship David, and it had very important information on it. It had the Royal Navy broad arrow on it. So this was a piece of a ship, and given the Royal Navy identification, it could well have related to Franklin. So and there was another next slide, another piece of debris that was found also on this island. So Andrew Sterling, the helicopter pilot, really is the hero of the Victoria Strait expedition, because his discovery of these two artifacts from a ship is what caused Parks Canada to kind of reorient their search. Next slide. And this is what happened. The investigator, the small boat that I showed you earlier, was used. They had a towfish sonar, and they were going along off the coast of that small island, and suddenly this remarkable image appeared, and this is turned out to be HMS Erebus, so Franklin's ship, in incredible condition and very shallow water. And so next slide, that triggered immediately effort by Parks Canada's remarkable underwater archaeology team to examine what was on the deck of the ship, and to try to these are highly skilled archaeologists, to try to understand which of the two vessels this was, confirm it was indeed one of Franklin's ships, and which vessel. Next slide. These are just Parks Canada images they were kind enough to share. They found all sorts of interesting artifacts, including cannons that were on the, for signals on the deck. And next slide. There's one there. Next slide. Various images. Next slide. There's another gun. And that's what I wanted to show you. That was I think the great moment of that first season. That's the bell from HMS Erebus. That bell has been collected. You can see, if you look carefully on the middle at the front of it, the view that you have, you can see the broad arrow. And the date is actually also visible on the on the bell, and I have a replica we can show you here in a moment. But it says 1845. So this is obviously a bell that belonged to one of Franklin's ships that has been recovered and has been conserved, and I believe has been now repatriated to the UK, where it's on display. So that is the bell of Erebus. Next slide. And this was the big announcement that we made. I'm there sitting to the right of Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Environment Minister Leona Aglukkaq, who, by the way, comes from, originally she's an Inuk woman from King William Island, and she was the Minister of Environment at the time. And you can see Ryan Harris on Harper's right. He was I guess, the lead archaeologist for this team, and he was the first to lay eyes on the wreck when that sonar passed over top of it. Next slide. And that really concludes my talk. I've written 2 books on Franklin. The first is Frozen Time, the Fate of the Franklin Expedition, which is still in print in the UK by Bloomsbury. And this book, Franklin's Lost Ship, which is an account of the discovery of HMS Erebus. And the Frozen Time, by the way, was republished a number of years ago, and we can go to the big picture of me so people can escape. There we go. This is Frozen Time, and a few years ago, well, in the early 2000s, the publisher contacted me and said, "Well, the book has sold incredibly well. It's had a great run, but we're thinking of letting it go out of print." unless you can find someone who, would write an introduction or something that would give it another sort of push. And I said, what about an introduction by Margaret Atwood? Would that help? And they said, yes, absolutely, that would help. So I asked Margaret Atwood, and she indeed, she's been fascinated by this story. She wrote an introduction. I must say it's a mixed blessing because it did give Frozen Time a huge boost, and the book is still actually in print. But the introduction is so good, it's so brilliant, and it is written by probably one of the world's preeminent writers that I hate to say it, but it's the best part of the book. Anyway, I'll let you be the judge of that. But I'm so honored that Margaret Atwood would have contributed to this book. So that concludes my talk, and I'm really grateful to you for your interest. I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, so the Canadian counterpart to the RGS. And we continue to do Arctic research every year through over $800,000 annually in expedition grants that we give out. And a year ago, we were the lead. We organized the expedition that located Shackleton's last ship, Quest, in the Labrador Sea. So we remain very interested in polar exploration history. Anyway, thank you for your time and interest.
Thank you very much, John. I'll just wait for Andrew to come back as well. We've got some questions. We've got a question in the chat so far. John, would you like me just to read these out, or can you see the chat from your screen?
I cannot, no.
Okay, so I'll just read this one out. So we've got a question from someone in the audience saying, given the strong evidence of scurvy and high lead levels, what do you think of the suggestion that trichinosis was a major factor in the deaths?
I don't really have a view on that. I guess the possibility exists, but there's no physical evidence to support that. What's unique about the research that was done here is that it's all based on, forensic examination. The bone was tested, the human, sorry, the soft tissues were tested, and that's where the information that we built our thesis on came from. It came from actual physical evidence, which is quite airtight. The other theories that I've heard are highly speculative. That I don't think we can rule them out. It's just a question of what evidence is there that that indeed was the case. Certainly didn't it didn't affect other expeditions of in that early search period in that way. So it's hard to say. Whereas was lead, the issue with lead is proven, and the fact that James Clark Ross also is experiencing this highly unusual illness aboard ship makes you wonder again. It's very close in time to Franklin, and they had plenty of food with them. Goldner was also the same supplier to Franklin, to Ross. It's just it remains an interesting problem, and I'm not sure the discovery of the ships is going to allow us to solve that one way or the other.
Thank you very much, John. We have another question. Are there hopes of raising the Rex like, I think it's going to be light, but are there hopes of raising the Rex like the Mary Rose?
I mean, it is certainly possible if they are left where they are, in time, even though in the cold water has preserved them so well, they will eventually deteriorate and be lost. But there's such great technology now in terms of digital twinning. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure, have seen some of the amazing imagery that the Endurance 22 team collected. They've been able to kind of recreate the Endurance digitally and create models built on that digital scan that was conducted that show every detail of the vessel. So the need to actually undertake this enormous, raising of the vessel, working to preserve the wood, it would be enormously costly. There's no way the government of Canada would ever undertake such a project, given the other priorities. So I just don't see it happening obviously, theoretically, it could be done. And I mean, wouldn't it be remarkable to see one of these ships preserved? But I can't see it happening.
Thank you, John. We've had another couple of questions come in. So the first one I can see on the list is were the differences in lead levels in Y1 and Y2 results due to differing locations, the lead levels decreasing naturally over time, or any other reason?
And I'm sorry, I don't think I'm in a position to answer that now. It's been a few years since I've given this talk, and I know that the levels were different. I think a lot of it relates to the amount of tinned food that would have been provided to these men. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily the only source of lead. They had lead wicked candles. They likely had lead soldered water and heating systems on the vessels. But it depends on the amount of food that they would have been given that came from the tin food supply. I've actually seen some of the tins, the remains of the tins. In fact, when I first went up there, there was a tin cairn that had been built on Beach Island, and the remains of that were still visible. And sadly, over time, there's been real attrition. I think souvenir hunters have taken off, lots of the remaining tins, but you could see the lead on the interior seams of these tins, and it's like candle wax dripping on these seams, huge gobs of lead. I don't know if you've seen the wonderful series, The Terror, which depicted the end of the Franklin expedition. Very well done, very accurate in many respects, excepting, of course, the creature that was involved in that storyline. But in one of the episodes, they're eating tinned foods, and one of the men, I think one of the officers, pulls out a chunk of lead from the food that he's eating, and indeed, that's a highly likely source of the much of the exposure that was seen.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of questions coming in, so we might not manage them all, but I'll try and give you another couple. We have, would there be any probability of a ship's log surviving in either wreck to give us a better understanding of what time they were trapped, or anything else in the wrecks that could give us a better understanding of the end of the expedition?
Yes, and that's there's huge amount of interest in the ongoing conservation work by Parks Canada. The underwater archaeology team have conducted a number of investigations of Erebus and also Terror, which was found subsequently. And they're filled with artifacts. They're incredible time capsule from that area. The evidence is there. Inuit accounts suggest that there may be human remains on at least one of those vessels. Um, there have been all sorts of artifacts already collected, including there are paper records, and I am told, and I'm not the best person um, to comment on this, but I have told that it's likely that some of the records will have survived in spite of being underwater all that time,
Yeah.
um, uh, in a way that you could actually read some of the accounts. The other thing that's really significant is that they had this primitive camera, this daguerreotype machine, on the expedition. So, it's very likely that those images, those plates, will have survived. So I think, we're just the team has barely been able to scratch the surface. It's very, very complex work to go into a vessel like that, and they have to be extraordinarily careful. And of course, they're very methodical in terms of the conservation work. So I think it may be many, many years before we get a complete picture based on information recovered from those two wrecks. But I do think that there will be a lot of a much greater insight into the Franklin mystery once that work is complete.
Thank you, John. We still have questions coming in. I don't want to kind of overload you, so I'm just going to cherry pick a couple more. One that I've just seen here, which I thought was quite interesting, was Parks Canada has recently announced that they will not be conducting any more annual dives on HMS Erebus and Terror. Do you have any more information behind this decision and reasoning?
Well, I think that there just are, it's a very complex program. They've already recovered a lot of material that's still being worked on and analyzed. There's an enormous cost to preserving some of the materials that have already been recovered. So I think it's a question of resources. I don't know the specifics of it. Those of us that participated and organizations that participated in the Victoria Strait expedition were recently honored by Parks Canada with replicas, and you can see behind me here a replica of the Erebus Bell. I don't know if you can see the broad arrows there and
Yeah.
the date. So we each organization received. I was also given at some point a miniature version of the bell here. These are incredible because they're exact replicas, but they're they're made using 3D printing technology. So we're very honored to have this. We are still obviously hugely interested in, as I think so many people are, in learning more about what happened to Franklin, and we still don't have a definitive account, and it's possible we never will. But I suspect Parks will be back visiting and investigating those ships in due course. It's just a question of timing.
Thank you very much. We could talk about this all night. We've still got questions coming in, but we'll just do one more, which I think was a really interesting question. How likely do you think it is that the body of Sir John Franklin will eventually be found?
That's a really interesting question. There are different theories as to what happened to Franklin himself, that he may have been buried at sea, um, that he was buried, interred as the three men at Beattie Island were interred, in somewhere along the route, or somewhere on King William Island. I know that every year there are explorers, people visiting King William Island, looking for Franklin's grave. It's possible one of these years they will find a grave. I think it's unlikely personally because, and I'd be very happy to retract that statement. But there were also Inuit accounts that at one point wooden boxes were found, one containing papers, one containing bone. If indeed human bones were found in a box, that would have been Franklin. There's a wonderful example. John Rowan, who had been the chief factor of Fort Edmonton, it's now Edmonton, Alberta, um, uh, died in the field. He was a factor with the Hudson's Bay Company, and he died at Fort Edmonton. And he was returned. They wanted to return the body. He was a very senior officer of the company, and they wanted to return his body for proper burial. And so, his remains were carried in a York boat uh, back to, I believe, if I recall correctly, back to what's now Churchill, Manitoba, transported to Liverpool, to London, back to Quebec, where he was buried, at a cemetery in Quebec. So I think that Sir John Franklin was the most senior explorer ever to have died in the field. I mean, long before Scott, who Sir John Franklin was a rear admiral, and I just can't imagine that he would have been left uh, in the ground of King William Island. I think that there would have been every effort to take his remains home, and that for burial, likely at Westminster Abbey, and so I think sadly there will not be a grave found, and I think that those bones, which are now who knows where they are, at Starvation Cove on the North American mainland, will never be found. So I don't think you'll ever see Sir John Franklin's remains located.
Thank you, John. I think that's all we've got time for on the question side. Thank you very much for joining us. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we could have just kept going all night here, but I know you're a
Well,
few hours behind.
I
But
just want to thank I want to thank you, and I want to thank the society for the incredible work that you're doing, to preserve Ray's childhood home. It's been a dream of mine to get there. So maybe you'll consider a future invitation to come and meet some of you in person. But it's wonderful work that you're doing. It's a fantastically important site historically, and Ray is one of the great names of Arctic exploration, not as well recognized as he should be, but a truly remarkable figure and someone whose manner of exploration and understanding of the indigenous peoples that he encountered was far advanced of so many others, Franklin included. So I really think that everything you do to advance his memory is really to be celebrated. And
Oh,
so if I can help in the future, please let me know.
Thank you very much, John. I'll hand over to Andrew to answer that one. Andrew's our president. Hopefully he'll appear in a wee second. There we go, Andrew.
here I am. Well, thank you very much, John, for those really lovely words about John Ray and our society and what we're doing. I'd always felt that John Franklin never left his boat, that they were preparing him to travel back for burial. So maybe those bones were his, or maybe there's another set yet. But anyway, thank you for an excellent talk, showing light in little corners that we rarely see.
Thanks so much,
No,
Andrew.
thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone, for your interest. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. Good night,
Cheers.
everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.